Find a comfortable position now. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you, bed, chair, floor, and feel the weight of the day beginning to lift. Take one slow breath in through your nose, and release it gently through your mouth. And again. In and out. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do. Only this story, and the soft current of your own breathing, carrying you slowly, slowly downstream. Close your eyes. Before there were cities with names you could find in any book, before the roads were paved or the forests cleared, before the clocks were invented to measure the passing of hours, there was a river. It moved the way rivers have always moved, which is to say, it moved the way time itself moves, not in a straight line, but in wide, unhurried curves, doubling back on itself sometimes, pausing in deep still pools, rushing briefly over smooth pale stones before widening again into something broad and quiet and green. This river had a name once. Many names, in fact, one for each people who had lived along its banks, each civilization that had risen and rested and eventually been absorbed back into the earth the way all living things eventually are. But those names are the kinds of things that only rivers remember now, and rivers do not often speak. What they do instead is flow. Let yourself feel that now, the sense of something moving. Not you. Just the story, just the current, pulling gently at the edges of your awareness. You are perfectly still. You are perfectly safe. The river is moving around you, and you are resting on its surface, like a single leaf that has found the slowest, most protected eddy in the whole wide water. The river began in the mountains, as all good rivers do, in the place where the snowpack releases itself every spring with the slow generosity of something that has been saving up all winter. The melt came off the high peaks in thin silver threads, each one finding the other the way old friends do, combining and gaining strength until by the time the water reached the foothills, it was already a murmur, already something that could be heard if you pressed your ear to the cold ground. Down from the mountains it came. Across the high plains, where the grass in the early days was so tall a person on horseback might vanish into it like a stone dropped into deep water. Through the limestone breaks, where the river cut canyons over 10,000 years of patient insistence, leaving walls of pale cream and amber that recorded in their layers every age of the world, the shallow sea that came before the land, the marshes that came before the prairies, the ice that came before the warmth. Everything that ever happened was written in those walls. Breathe in, and let it go. And along those banks, in the places where the river slowed and the soil was richest, in the bends and the bottomlands where the floodwaters had been leaving dark gifts of silt for millennia, there, people had been building their lives for longer than most of us can easily imagine. Not a few hundred years. Not 1,000. 12,000 years, at minimum. Perhaps longer. That is the number to carry with you into sleep tonight. 12,000 years of human life along a single river. 12,000 years of children learning to walk on the same ground, of old men watching the same sunsets, of women carrying water up from the banks in vessels shaped by hand from clay dug out of the very hills that the river had spent 100 centuries sculpting. Let that settle over you like a blanket. 12,000 years. It is so large a number that the mind cannot hold it all at once, and so it doesn't need to. You only need to rest inside it. You only need to let it hold you. We will travel back now, not all the way, but a good long way, to a time roughly 3,000 years ago, when a small community of perhaps 200 people lived at a particular bend in the river where the water moved most slowly and the willows grew thickest along the bank. The village was not large by the standards of what would come later. But it was careful. It was considered. Every structure in it had been placed with attention, the way you place objects on a shelf you care about, with thought given to the angle of the morning light, to the direction of the prevailing wind, to the way water would move across the ground in a heavy rain. The houses were round. This is something worth imagining slowly, round houses, with low doorways that faced east, toward the first light. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a woven framework of flexible branches plastered smooth with a mixture of clay and grass and water, and they were painted, in some cases, with shapes that to an outside eye might have looked like simple patterns, repeating triangles and zigzag lines, but which to the people who lived inside them told whole stories. A record of seasons. A map of constellations. A family's lineage, written not in words but in the colors the earth provided, red from iron oxide, white from ground limestone, black from charred wood ground to powder. Imagine you are arriving at this village just before dawn. The river is a soft sound off to your left, a low, consistent murmur, like the breathing of something enormous and calm. The air smells of wood smoke and damp clay and something green and indefinite, the smell of a living riverbank in a world that has not yet learned to be anything but wild. The cooking fires from the night before are banked down to low orange coals. A dog, small, tawny, with a curled tail, lifts its head at your arrival and then sets it back down with the easy disinterest of an animal that has decided you are not worth worrying about. Somewhere in one of the round houses, a baby is making the small sounds that babies make in the last hour before true sleep gives way to wakefulness, those little sighs and murmurs that mean they are somewhere between dreaming and the world. A woman is already awake. She is perhaps 50 years old, which in this time and place makes her one of the elders, someone whose opinions are sought and whose silences are interpreted carefully. She is sitting just outside the doorway of her house, facing east, her hands resting open in her lap, watching the horizon with the patient expression of someone who has watched 10,000 sunrises and found each one of them worth watching. Her name, in the language her people speak, means something close to she who counts the mornings. She earned the name not because she was given it at birth, but because as a young girl she began keeping a tally, small notches cut into a piece of river cane that she kept in a pouch at her belt, of the days between certain celestial events, certain alignments of stars, certain moments when the shadow of a particular stone fell in a particular direction. She had been keeping this tally for 40 years. The river cane of her original count had long since been transferred to a more permanent record, pressed into wet clay tablets that had been fired in the communal kiln and stored in a special structure at the center of the village, a building that also held seed stock, sacred objects, and the dried herbs used for medicine. She was, in the vocabulary of a world that hadn't invented that vocabulary yet, an astronomer. Rest in that for a moment. The oldest science. Looking up. Tracking the movements of light across darkness. Noticing patterns in the vast. She was doing this, here, along this river, 3,000 years ago, in the hour before dawn, while you slept. As the first gray light began to separate the horizon from the sky, she reached into a small clay bowl beside her and brought out a handful of dried berries, something from the previous autumn's harvest, still tart, still holding some of the summer in them, and she ate them slowly, one at a time, with the deliberate attention of someone who has learned that pleasure extends when you refuse to hurry it. This was her morning. This was enough. The river gave and gave and gave. In spring, it flooded. This was not a catastrophe, it was a calendar event, anticipated and prepared for, the annual renewal of the soil that made the bottomland gardens so spectacularly productive. When the water receded, it left behind a thin layer of fine dark silt, and into this the village women pressed seeds with their thumbs: corn, beans, squash, the three sisters, the combination that sustained so many of the continent's peoples, that trio of plants that when grown together create their own small ecosystem, the corn providing the stalk for the beans to climb, the beans fixing nitrogen in the soil, the broad leaves of the squash shading the ground and keeping the moisture in. The river gave fish, pike, perch, catfish so large that catching one was an event worth commemorating with a story told around the fire. It gave mussels along its shallow crossings, dozens of species, each with its own shell shape, each shell a small sculpture the river had collaborated with evolution to produce. The meat was eaten. The shells were shaped into tools, into ornaments, into the small flat discs that were strung on cord and worn at the throat. Think of a mussel shell, the way it curves, the way the inside catches light, that deep iridescent nacre. Someone 3,000 years ago thought it was beautiful too. Found it along this river. Held it in their palm the same way you might hold a stone that catches your eye on a beach. Beauty is not a recent invention. The river gave clay. This was perhaps its most transformative gift, because clay is a kind of permanence. Clay can be shaped. Clay remembers the shape it was given, if you are patient with it, if you dry it slowly and fire it carefully. The pottery made along this river had its own style, a certain way of pinching the rim, a certain incised geometric pattern applied with a carved paddle before firing, that archaeologists, many centuries later, would use to trace the movement of these people across the landscape, to map the trading relationships they maintained with communities hundreds of miles away. A pot found in a river valley far to the north, clay that had been fired along these banks, decorated in this style, carried there as a gift or perhaps as a container for something valuable, dried medicine, dye, oil, tells a story. It says, "We were here, and we knew people there, and between us there was relationship." The river gave wood, great stands of cottonwood and willow along its banks, and back from the banks on the higher ground, oak and hickory and pawpaw and persimmon. The pawpaws were something the people along this river loved extravagantly, that tropical tasting fruit that grows so incongruously in the temperate forest, its pulp yellow and sweet and impossibly rich. Every autumn, when the pawpaws ripened, the village went to the pawpaw groves in something like a celebration. People came from neighboring communities to take part. The harvest was also a gathering, a council, a market, a reunion of extended families who spent most of the year in their separate bends of the river and came together in the pawpaw groves to trade information along with goods, news of game movements, warnings about weather, the slow accumulation of the collective intelligence of a people who lived very close to the world. Close your eyes a little more. Let the pawpaw grove be real for a moment. The trees are low and spreading, their large leaves making a dense canopy that keeps the understory cool and dim even in late summer. The fruit hangs in clusters, green going to yellow going to a deep gold green when fully ripe. Someone is laughing somewhere in the trees. Two children are running between the trunks. An old man is sitting with his back against a trunk and his eyes half closed, exactly the way you are now, resting inside the warmth of the afternoon while the voices of the people he loves move around him like water. 1,000 years later, and a good distance south along the same river's tributary system, something extraordinary happened. A city rose. Not overnight, cities never rise overnight, despite the way history sometimes tells it. It rose the way a river cuts a canyon, through the patient accumulation of countless small decisions, each one building on the ones before, each generation inheriting a place that was slightly more organized, slightly more intentional, slightly more capable of sustaining large numbers of people than the one that came before. But by the time the city reached its peak, roughly 1,000 years ago, in what we would call the 11th and 12th centuries, it was the largest settlement north of Mexico. Its population at its height may have been 15,000 people, possibly more. Its central mound, a vast earthwork platform constructed over generations by the deliberate movement of an almost unimaginable quantity of soil, basket by basket carried on human backs, rose 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. From the top of that mound, on a clear day, you could see for miles in every direction, the river glittering to the west, the forested uplands to the east, and below you, arranged in a careful geometry that spoke of planning and intention and civic pride. The plazas and wooden structures and subsidiary mounds of a city that was, at that moment, one of the great urban centers of the entire world. We call this place Cahokia today. The people who built it may have called it something else entirely, we don't know for certain, because they left no written language, only the immense and eloquent language of their earthworks, their art, their astronomical alignments, their trade networks that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic watershed to the Rocky Mountain foothills. Rest in the enormity of that for a moment, a city of 15,000 people, 1,000 years ago, in the middle of North America. Let it be real. The city was organized around a central plaza roughly the size of 50 modern football fields laid end to end. Around this plaza, mounds of various sizes served different purposes. Some were platforms for elite residences or ceremonial structures, some were burial mounds, some were markers in a landscape-scaled calendar, positioned with astronomical precision to track the solstices and equinoxes, to tell the farmers in the surrounding countryside when to plant and when to expect the floods and when the first frost would come. There was a circle of large wooden posts. Archaeologists, when they uncovered the post holes centuries later, called it Woodhenge, after the famous monument in England, arranged so that from a standing position at the circle's center, a person watching the horizon on the morning of the spring equinox would see the sun rise directly over the summit of Monk's Mound. The city's builders had done the mathematics, had calculated the angles, had arranged their largest monument in precise relationship to the sun's movement across the sky. She who counts the mornings would have understood immediately. The marketplace was a daily gathering, and in its stalls and blanket-spread displays you could find goods from so far away that their presence here requires a moment of recalibration about what trade network means. Copper from the mines near Lake Superior, hammered into the shapes of birds and serpents. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, from beaches 1,200 miles to the south. Chert from distant quarries, napped into blades with a skill that made the finished tools look like they had been manufactured rather than made by hand. Mica from the Appalachian highlands, that strange glittering mineral that the craftspeople of this era used to create objects of such delicate beauty that they still catch the breath of the archaeologists who uncover them. And food. The city could not sustain itself from its immediate surroundings. No city of 15,000 people can, no matter how rich the soil. Food came in from the agricultural villages that surrounded Cahokia in all directions, corn stored in large communal granaries, dried fish from the river, smoked game from the uplands, oil pressed from the seeds of native plants, dried berries, roots, nuts. Imagine the smell of that marketplace, corn roasting, wood smoke, the mineral smell of freshly worked stone, the green smell of the river on a warm day, tanned hides, dried herbs, the particular warm animal smell of dogs and people gathered together in a small space. All of it ordinary to the people who lived it. All of it so ordinary they probably never stopped to think, this is remarkable. This is a world in full flower. This is what 10,000 years of accumulated human learning and effort and love looks like when it reaches a particular moment of flourishing. And then, as all things do, it changed. Not dramatically. Not in a single catastrophic moment. Over the course of a century or more, the city's population declined. The surrounding forests had been cleared for fuel and for agriculture, and without the trees, the rains moved differently across the landscape. The soils, farmed intensively for generations, gave less. The political structures that had kept the city unified began to loosen, the way the fibers of a rope will loosen when the tension that has been holding them together gradually releases. By 1400, the great central plaza was quiet. The mounds still stood, they would stand for centuries more, long enough for European explorers to encounter them and puzzle over their origins, long enough for American farmers to plow around their bases, long enough to survive into our own era as protected sites, visited today by people who stand at their summits and look out over the same river that carried the builders' canoes 1,000 years ago. The city had dispersed, its people moving outward, carrying their knowledge, their traditions, their stories, their ways of reading the sky and planting the Three Sisters and making pottery, carrying all of it in the only containers that really matter, which are the minds and mouths of living people who pass what they know to the people they love. Dispersion is not disappearance. Let that move through you gently, as you rest. Dispersion is not disappearance. We will rest now in a gentler time, the same river, perhaps 700 years ago, in a season of great mellowness. It is October. Or what we would call October, though the people who live along this stretch of the river measure their year differently, not in months named for Roman emperors and gods, but in the behaviors of the world itself. This is the moon of falling leaves. The moon when the deer are fat. The moon when the geese speak loudly about going. All three things are happening simultaneously. The leaves are coming down in long, slow spirals, the cottonwoods first, their leaves turning a clear yellow that makes the river corridor look as though someone has been generous with gold. Then the oaks, going amber and rust. Then the maples on the higher ground, which flame briefly red before letting go. The deer are in their autumn condition, rounded and glossy from a summer of feeding, moving in small groups through the forest edge in the long amber light of the late afternoons, their coats thickened already for the winter coming. And overhead, in long skein formations that appear on the northern horizon every morning now and continue throughout the day, the geese are moving south. Their voices carry down to the river valley in that distinctive two-note call, the sound that is, for anyone who has grown up near water in the interior of this continent, one of the most reliable sounds of autumn, a sound woven into the fabric of October the way wood smoke is, the way fallen leaves crushed underfoot are. If you can hear them now, in your memory or imagination, let them call. That sound is ancient. Those geese or their ancestors flew this same river valley 700 years ago, 500 years ago, 12,000 years ago. The sound is as old as the river. It is older, maybe. A small community lives here now, not a city, not even a large village, but perhaps 30 families, loosely organized around a shared understanding of who they are and what they owe each other. Their structures are more permanent than the round houses of our earlier village. Some of them are substantial rectangular buildings with solid walls and sleeping platforms built up off the ground, covered in robes made from the skins of animals the men have hunted over the course of many seasons. There is a woman here. There is always a woman who matters, in any story worth telling, who is perhaps 35 years old and who spends most of her October days at work on something that will occupy her for years, a robe made from the pelts of more than 100 beaver, each small pelt cut and prepared and sewn to the next with a bone needle and sinew thread in a pattern that, when finished, will create a garment of extraordinary warmth and beauty. She works slowly. This is not because she is inefficient, but because she is doing several things at once. She is sewing, yes. But she is also listening to her daughter, who is 7 years old and has reached the age where questions arrive in an uninterrupted stream and must be answered honestly. Why do the geese go south? Because the food they eat goes away when the water freezes, and they know this. And they trust the knowing enough to fly a very long way to be where the food will be. How do they know which way is south? They feel it. The way you feel the difference between the front of the house and the back. Do they always come back? Always. They always come back. Why? Because this is where they are from. Because the river called them back from wherever they wintered, called them with the smell of the water warming in spring, with the particular quality of the light, with something in the air that meant home to them. The woman set down her sewing for a moment and looked at her daughter, this small person with her serious face and her perpetual questions, and she thought about what it means to be from somewhere. To have a place that calls you back. To carry the river in your body the way the geese carry their map of it, not in words, not in anything that could be written down, but in the muscles of the chest, in the particular weight of the air breathed into the lungs for the first time, in the 10,000 mornings of a life that started here and will, in some form, always belong here. Let your own body feel that now, the place you are from. Or the place that feels like home, even if you weren't born there. The sense of a geography that belongs to you and that you belong to. Rest in that feeling. It is one of the oldest human feelings there is. The daughter eventually ran off to join other children in some game that involved the river's edge and a great deal of splashing and shouting, and the woman returned to her sewing. And the afternoon light moved across the valley in its slow October way, everything golden and cooling, the shadows growing long earlier now than they had a month ago, the world gently, beautifully insisting on its turning. Rivers are archives. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It is literally true that rivers are places where the past accumulates, where the objects and traces of human lives are deposited and sometimes preserved across centuries that would otherwise erase everything. Along the river we have been following tonight, archaeologists have been careful and patient, excavating sites with the slow attention that this kind of work requires, brushes and dental picks as often as shovels, each small discovery catalogued and placed in its context, each object considered not just as itself but as a piece of a much larger story. What they have found is staggering in its implications. Seeds. Preserved in sealed clay vessels or in the anaerobic conditions of river-bottom deposits, seeds that germinate after hundreds of years and produce plants whose descendants had been thought lost. There is something about this that stops the breath, a seed that has been sleeping for 600 years, waking up in a scientist's greenhouse, producing a fruit that no one living had tasted before and that people had tasted every autumn for 10,000 years before the varieties were lost. The past is not as gone as we think. They have found tools of extraordinary refinement. A chirp point, napped with a precision that required years of practice to achieve, found in a deposit that is 9,000 years old. The person who made it was a master of their craft, someone who understood the physics of flint, the way conchoidal fracture propagates through stone, the way pressure applied at exactly the right angle and force will send a perfect, controlled flake curling away from the core. With the kind of deep body knowledge that comes from a lifetime of practice. That knowledge was taught to them by someone who learned it from someone else, in a chain of teaching that stretched back to the very first person who discovered that certain stones could be shaped. They have found music. Not the music itself, sound does not preserve, but the instruments that made it, bone flutes, their finger holes drilled with patience and precision, their length calculated to produce specific pitches. A flute recovered from a site along the river, the wing bone of a sandhill crane, perforated with 4 holes, was analyzed and found to produce, when blown by a musician who understood its embouchure, tones that fall clearly within a pentatonic scale. A pentatonic scale. The same system of tones that underlies music from China, from West Africa, from the Celtic traditions, from the Mississippi Delta blues. Something in the mathematics of vibration that the human ear finds beautiful seems to converge across all cultures toward the same intervals. Someone along this river, 3,000 years ago, blew a cranebone flute and produced a melody that would sound, to your ear tonight, like something almost recognizable. Almost familiar. Like something heard in a dream. They have found art. Pottery incised with images of the world the makers inhabited, cedar waxwings with their yellow-tipped tails, rendered with an accuracy that is also a love letter to the bird. Catfish, their whiskers carefully depicted. Human figures dancing, their arms raised, in postures that suggest ceremony. Abstract geometric patterns that appear and reappear across vast stretches of time and space, triangles nested within triangles, spirals that echo the forms of shells and water and the coiling of ferns in early spring. They have found evidence of medicine. Botanical remains associated with structures that may have been used for healing. Rattlesnake master, used by many peoples as a general strengthener. Black cohosh, whose chemical compounds we now understand have effects on hormonal systems. Yarrow, whose name across many languages contains some reference to its wound-staunching properties. Healers along this river knew things. Not the same things that a modern hospital knows, but things, real things, knowledge earned through careful observation and tested across generations, a pharmacopoeia assembled not in a book but in the practiced knowledge of the women and men who specialized in it, who memorized it, who passed it down in the same way all important knowledge was passed down, by telling, by showing, by the patient repetition that turns a foreign fact into a known thing. You are resting inside all of that history now. All of those centuries of knowing. The river is moving through it, and you are resting, and there is nothing to do and nowhere to be, only this slow drifting through time. It is worth spending a moment with the sky. The sky over this river, in the centuries before artificial light reached across the continent, was a different sky than most of us live under today. On a moonless night, away from any fire, the Milky Way was not a faint smudge at the edge of vision, it was a structural feature of the sky, a river of light so dense and complex that it cast shadows. The individual stars within it were too numerous to distinguish from each other, but the dark lanes that ran through it, dust clouds between us and the galactic center, were clearly visible, and it was these dark lanes, these rivers of shadow within the river of light, that many peoples of the Americas traced as constellations. Not the bright points, but the dark spaces between them. Think about that for a moment, seeing the sky in negative, tracing the shapes of absence rather than presence. A different kind of seeing. A different kind of knowing. The people who lived along our river tracked the sky the way we check our phones, constantly, automatically, because the information it contained was immediately useful. The position of Orion on the horizon told you where you were in the winter. The heliacal rising of the Pleiades in spring told you when to plant. The behavior of the moon told you when the fish would run, when the deer would be moving, when the shellfish were in their best condition. But the sky was also more than a calendar. It was a story, or many stories, and those stories were not decoration. They were load-bearing. They carried the knowledge of where people came from, what they were responsible for, how the world worked, what happened to the good and the foolish, how the animals came to have their shapes, why the river runs the direction it runs. The stories were a technology. On summer evenings, when the day's heat had given way to the long blue dusk and the fireflies were beginning their slow conversation across the meadows, families gathered. Children leaned against the bodies of grandparents and listened to stories in the way that children listen when they have not yet been taught to divide their attention, with the whole body, with the breath, with the weight of their small heads resting against someone who is warm and familiar and safe. An elder spoke in the unhurried way that comes with age and confidence, in the knowledge that the story does not need to be raced through, that the pleasure of the telling is as much about the quality of the voice and the quality of the pauses as it is about the events described. You are that child now, in this moment. The voice is unhurried. The fire is warm. The sky overhead is full of information that will take a lifetime to understand, and that is fine. That is how it is supposed to work. A lifetime is what you have, and a lifetime is enough. The Milky Way, one elder might explain, is a road. The road the souls of the departed travel, moving from this world toward whatever comes next. This is why the dead are buried facing west, the direction of sunset, the direction of going. This is why, when someone you love has died, you go outside on clear nights and look at that road and think of them walking it, moving toward something bright. The story stitched the living and the dead together. They stitched the human world to the animal world, to the plant world, to the world of water and stone and sky. Nothing was separate. Nothing was without relationship. The catfish in the river was a person in a different form. The cedar tree was a person in a different form. The storm that came up suddenly from the southwest, cracking the sky open with lightning, was a person with urgent business who had not had time to be polite about it. This is not a childlike worldview. It is a complex one that requires constant attention to relationship, to reciprocity, to the question of what is owed and what is given freely. If the river gives fish, something is owed in return. If the forest gives deer, something is owed. The ceremonies were, among other things, a systematic practice of gratitude, a formal acknowledgement of the debts that a living people accumulates simply by eating, by breathing, by taking what it needs from a world that has not stopped being generous. In the quiet of this moment, in the dark behind your eyes, feel that generosity. The world has been generous. The night holds you. The breath comes without effort. Rest in that. The river could speak, if we could translate the language of water moving over stone, of current pressing against bank, of the particular sound a river makes in summer when it is lower and slower than at any other time of year, that low purling murmur, almost conversational, what would it say? It would say, I remember everything. It would say, the woman who dipped her jar here, at this bend, in this exact angle of morning light, 3,000 years before you were born, I remember the weight of her footstep on this bank. I remember the way she paused before she bent, the way all people pause before they bend, feeling the catch in the lower back, taking a breath first. I remember the sound her jar made entering the water, that hollow wooden or ceramic resonance, and the way the surface broke and or formed around it. It would say, the children who swam here in every summer since the glaciers melted, I remember all of them. The ones who were afraid of the deep part and the ones who were not. The first child who learned that if you float on your back and look up at the sky and hold very still, the current will carry you downstream slowly, slowly, and the sky above will be a moving picture of clouds and cottonwood leaves and the occasional passing hawk, and the world will feel, for those few minutes, entirely manageable. It would say, I remember the canoes, thousands of them, across thousands of years, dugouts carved from the largest cottonwoods, their hulls so thin that a person standing in one would feel the water through the wood as a kind of aliveness, a sensitivity. The paddlers moved me without thinking about it, the way you move through air without thinking about it, because I was the medium of their lives, the highway, the food source, the margin of safety, the road home. It would say, I remember the floods, when I was more than myself, when I spread across the bottomlands and became something vast and shallow and temporary. The people moved back from my edge. Then, carrying what they could, and waited. They had learned, it took generations, but they learned, that the waiting was the right response. That after the flood, the soil was richer. That the flood was not punishment but provision. That what looks like disaster from inside the moment sometimes looks, from a longer view, like generosity. The river is speaking now, very quietly, beneath the level of your conscious hearing. Feel it rather than listen for it. It is the sound underneath all other sounds, the constant, the patient, the one that was here before you arrived and will be here after. There is a kindness in not knowing everything. The people who lived along this river, all of them, across all the centuries we have visited tonight, did not know that they were living in what future people would call the prehistoric past. They did not know that a civilization was going to arrive from across an ocean and change everything, because that event was not yet in the future that their present could perceive. They did not know that their languages would be suppressed, that their ceremonies would be forbidden for a time, that the land their dead were buried in would be sold and plowed and built upon. They knew only what was immediately known, the quality of this morning's light, the temperature of the river, the readiness of the corn, the face of a beloved person across the fire. This is not ignorance. This is the condition of being alive, to know only the present you inhabit, to act only from the information available in this moment, to love what is in front of you with the full force of that love, not saving any of it back for what might come. You are in your own present now. This moment, this warmth, this bed or chair or floor that holds you. This breath, and this one after it. 3,000 years from now, someone might think of you, if the records survive, if the stories hold, if any archaeologist sifts through the sediment of this era and finds the traces of your time, and wonder what it was like to be here now. What the evenings smelled like. What you thought about when you were falling asleep. What you loved. What you loved. That is the thing that endures. Not the objects, not the buildings, not even the words, but the love that made them. The love that went into the painted wall of the round house. The love that held the child while the story was told. The love that kept the astronomical tally in the cane, year after year, trying to understand the patterns in the sky. Love is the thing the river remembers best. The river is moving right now. Not the river of memory or story, the actual river. Whatever river is nearest to you as you lie here in the dark, or if not a river then a creek, a stream, a drainage channel that moves its modest water towards something larger, which moves towards something larger still, which moves eventually to the sea. It is moving at this hour, in the dark, without witnesses. The fish are doing what fish do at night, the catfish are moving along the bottom, feeling the current with their barbels, finding what the current has deposited there. The mussels on the shallower substrate are doing something ancient and patient that does not require light. The herons have found their roosting trees and stand in them motionless, one-legged, somewhere between asleep and awake, that particular avian restfulness that allows them to be up and hunting again at the first gray light. The river does not need to be watched to be beautiful. It is beautiful in the dark. It has been beautiful in the dark for 10,000 years, on every night of every season, through every weather, while every generation of the people who lived along it slept and dreamed and woke and went about their days and eventually became part of the earth that the river continued to move through, patiently, without hurry, toward the sea. You are part of that continuity now. Your sleep tonight is part of it. The breath you are taking, slow now, slower, is the same air that moved across this continent for 12,000 years of human habitation. The darkness around you is the same darkness that the woman with the astronomical tally sat in before the sun came up, patient and attentive, counting the mornings. Count this one. This quiet, dark, dissolving morning of your own consciousness moving toward sleep. 1. And rest. Morning will come the way morning always comes, gradually, then all at once. The dark will become gray, and the gray will become pink at the edges, and the pink will become the full, indifferent gold of another day beginning, and the river will catch that gold and run with it downstream, past the places where the mounds are still standing, past the bends where the villages once gathered, past the bottomlands where the three sisters once grew in their millions of small green rows. The river will carry that light downstream the way it has always carried things downstream, not storing them, not keeping them, but moving them along, as a river must, as is the nature of flowing water. And what it cannot carry, what it leaves behind, what sinks to the bottom and stays, that is what we call history. Small things. A clay pot, impeccably made, that held dried berries through a winter that is now 2,000 years ago. A flute made from a crane's bone, its 4 holes placed with mathematical care. A seed, sealed in dark clay, waiting with a patience that makes human patience look brief and nervous. A footprint in dried mud at the edge of a bank, from a morning so long ago that the mud became stone before anyone thought to look for it. The river remembers. And now you are part of what it remembers. This night, this breath, this slow and gentle falling away from the day and into the long, dark, unhurried country of sleep, the river is carrying it forward. Along with everything else it carries. Along with 12,000 years of mornings and midnights and seasons and fires and children running on the banks and old people sitting with their eyes half closed and the geese calling from somewhere overhead about the great business of their going. You are part of all of that. Rest now. The river is moving. Everything is remembered. Sleep.